Hello and welcome to Unit 1, Section 3, Episode 6 of Fisher's Class Notes. Today we're going to talk about how America became independent, or how the heck did we beat the strongest army in the world. Our vocabulary: Continental Congress, George Washington. We'll talk a little bit about Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, a little bit more about the Minutemen, Hessian mercenaries, the Battle of Yorktown, and the Paris Peace Conference of 1783. Before we begin, I really need you to understand four major things. One, remember, we were proud. The 13 colonies were really proud to be part of the British Empire. It was the wealthiest and strongest empire in the world. They didn't want independence until really like Thomas Paine and the first major battles came along. They were loyal. Most people were really, really loyal. Number two, Britain tried to force the colonists to be obedient again. The attack of Lexington and Concord, like we talked about, Fort Ticonderoga, and the Battle of Bunker Hill. These were all the British trying to remind the colonists how strong they were, but it actually backfired. Instead of becoming more loyal and scared, we became more independent. Three, the British were more powerful, but they had a much harder battle. It's much harder to conquer a people than it is for a people to survive. Britain had to conquer the colonies again, whereas the American colonies just had to keep fighting until the British gave up. And number three, America really won thanks to the help of the French and the Spanish. Yes, Adrian, we could talk a little bit about Spanish today. Okay, strategies and advantages. The British assumed they would win easily. One, reminding the colonists that they were super powerful and wealthy. Two, capturing a major city. Three, isolating New England, because they thought all the trouble was really in New England. And four, capturing George Washington. The Continental Army, really the only strategy was survival. All the colonies had to do was keep fighting and survive. And so most of the beginning of the war, all Washington is doing is like sneaking away and retreating. Fighting did begin before the Declaration of Independence. Last week, you might remember, we talked about the Battle of Bunker Hill, and we talked about the Lexington and Concord. So the British thought the colonists would give up after they reminded us how strong they were, but of course that didn't happen. The Battle of Bunker Hill, remember that the British lost half their men of the 2,000 soldiers that they had. Even though they technically won, they lost half their men. The first battles, all before 1776, the Declaration of Independence, we talked about last week. The first two were colonial victories. Bunker Hill, again, technically a British victory, but they lost half their men. All right, so what are the British advantages? Well, they have the biggest army and navy in the world, super wealthy. That's important when you need to buy all the things and produce all the things an army needs, like guns and food and all these things. They could levy taxes if they needed more stuff. They just had to raise taxes. Continental Congress didn't have that power, and they had a really well-trained army. It was very popular to become a British soldier. People wanted to do it. It was a really good way to rise through the ranks. British disadvantages: they had no clear target. If you attack a country, you go for the capital, or you try to invade the capital. But these were 13 individual colonies just united together. Think about the term United States. Our purpose was just to be different states working together. They had to worry always about the French and the Spanish, who ended up helping us win the war. Britain didn't want to fight other Britons. That's why they had to hire Hessian mercenaries. People didn't want to go and fight and kill their own people. They weren't conquering a new group of people. And Britain constantly underestimated the colonies. We'll talk a lot about this. Continental Congress advantages: all we needed to do was survive. We weren't attacking anyone. We weren't trying to colonize somebody else. We just had to keep surviving. Two, we could focus all our energies on the war. We didn't have to worry about France and Spain. We just had to focus on the war. Three, we were fighting to protect our homes, and so it became very personal for people because they felt like they were protecting themselves against an invading army. We had a lot of disadvantages, though. There was no clear government. The Continental Congress had no power to tax, only delegates kind of arguing and working together with no power because there's no constitution yet. Regionalism: the colonies fought against each other. They were worried that New England colonies would have too much power, or Southern colonies would have too much power, and they had no trained army. The Minutemen were great soldiers, but these were mostly farmers and merchants. They weren't professionally trained soldiers. Okay, so we talked a lot about how the British were underestimating the colonists. After the British captured major cities like Boston and Massachusetts, they went to New York. They were trying to divide the colonies, but this did not work because, again, there's no clear capital. There were some major battles, including the battles of White Plains and New York, and they thought that, okay, now we can isolate New England and all the trouble will stop. The southern colonies are loyal, but that wasn't the case. The British were overconfident. In fact, when they won this battle in New York, in White Plains, New York, they didn't even they could have probably ended the war if they had kept fighting, but they decided, you know what, let's just do it tomorrow. And they all went to bed, and while in the middle of the night, General Washington secretly snuck out with his whole army. They retreated out of New York across into New Jersey. And so this was like middle of the night, they're sneaking away. Not very inspiring. We think of General Washington as leading this great army, but a lot of the time he was just retreating. Continental Congress was weak and they couldn't raise a stronger army. In fact, the soldiers only fought for 1 year, and at the end of the year they were giving up. They just got to go home. They weren't giving up, they just didn't have to sign on again. So it's towards the end of the year, it's December, it's freezing, pretty much most of the fighting stops at the time. But George Washington thinks, my army's about to go home. I've got to figure out how, I got to get people back excited about the war again. So we get the battles of Trenton and Princeton, New Jersey. General Washington decided to inspire his troops and get them to attack in the middle of winter and at night. They crossed the Delaware River in the middle of the night, and they attacked a huge camp of Hessian mercenaries on December 26, 1776. So this is like during the holidays, the day after Christmas, when people don't usually fight. And they captured 2/3 of the British forces in the Hessian mercenaries. So that was a huge win. It was a small battle, but it gave colonists hope. In fact, there were some British soldiers saying, they looked like they were going to give up the week before, and now they're all of a sudden excited again. In fact, one awesome quote about watching Washington fighting, this little soldier said, "I shall never forget what I felt at Princeton on his account when I saw him," meaning George Washington, "brave all the dangers of the field and his important life, hanging, as it were, by a single hair, with 1,000 deaths flying around him. Believe me, I thought not of myself." So these soldiers are seeing Washington fighting with them. He's not just hanging back, and they get inspired again. In fact, most of them sign up for another year of fighting. British General Lord Cornwallis was angry at the loss, but he thought, again, he had George Washington cornered. They knew exactly where they were, so they'd get him the next day. I mean, look at this guy. Doesn't he look totally overconfident? So they waited till the next day, and guess what George Washington did? He did the same thing he did after White Plains. He snuck out, and they left in the middle of the night. In fact, they left a bunch of fires burning, so it looked like the soldiers were still there, but they retreated in the middle of the night. Battle of Saratoga, this was really huge, September 19th and October 7th, 1777. The colonists surrounded the British fort, and they actually captured a bunch of weapons, and this was really important because remember, the Continental Congress could not get new weapons. They didn't have importance. This is a huge battle for the Continental Congress to win. After they won this battle, they got the help of the French. Here's a picture of Benjamin Franklin. It was a painting of Benjamin Franklin with all these French ladies. He was very popular at court with the women at court. He was 72 at the time, so he was an older gentleman, but he had a lot of fun. As soon as the Declaration of Independence was signed, Continental Congress sent delegates to Europe. They sent John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin went to Spain, and John Jay went to Spain. France decided to support the colonists and by pledging them their navy because of the battle at Saratoga, which is in New York. So really this battle was most important because it made other countries support the Americans. The war did become harder for the British because now they really have to worry about the French. They couldn't just focus on the Americans. Spain also decided to help in 1779. They gave money and weapons and some of their navy to again attack their old enemy, Great Britain. Okay, so the Continental Congress did struggle though. Even though they had won these little battles, they still were really, really poor. they couldn't tax, and that was huge. And literally George Washington, during Valley Forge, the winter, in wintertime, 1777, 1778, he basically was watching his army starving and freezing to death because they didn't have supplies. Alexander Hamilton was like knocking on farm doors, just trying to get like food and blankets and stuff like that. 250,000 American soldiers were killed because of the winter by starving and freezing to death by February 1778. So Valley Forge showed General Washington and Alexander Hamilton that having a government with no power like the Continental Congress was not going to work. It was not going to help because you can't function because there's nobody that has the power to make decisions. And so they decided that they wanted a strong central government. Remember that when we get to our next unit. But we kept surviving, and that was the key. We survived, and the British were overconfident. The British won many battles in the middle states, so the middle, because of course now we're states now, not colonies, but in the middle states in the south, and captured Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina. So these are major cities, but again, it doesn't matter because we can just keep moving. The British troops treated Southerns very poorly. They raided the farms, trampled crops with their armies, and paraded around how superior they were. That did not scare the South. In fact, it just made loyalists turn into patriots, so it backfired on them. And finally, Battle of Yorktown, October 1781. George Washington and the Continental Congress surround the British Lord Cornwallis, and they captured 9,000 soldiers, and essentially that's the end of the war. They're only able to do this, though, because of the help of the French. The French support by bringing their navy, so it's all about just the right time, the right place. So the navy comes up at the same time that that Washington and his army move forward. The French Navy and the Spanish Navy surround the British in the water. General Lord Cornwallis surrenders. And then finally we get 1783, the Paris Peace Conference, where Great Britain finally recognizes America as an independent country, and we become independent. All right, thanks for watching.